And so, 1979, Thatcher comes to power. 1 in 3 union members had voted for her. It's important to remember that. She waited until her second term of office to deal with the NUM, as they were easily the most powerful union in the country. Nicholas Ridley had in 1978 created a plan to deal with the NUM. He planned a law against secondary action, a development of gas and nuclear power, and the stockpiling of coal. Now, the short-term causes of the Great Coal Strike. Thatcher had appointed Ian McGregor to be head of the National Coal Board to reform the industry. The coal industry had long ceased to be profitable, and she cut the subsidy to the industry, threatening 20 unprofitable pits with closure. In 1981, the NUM elected Scargill as president. He claimed that the government planned to close 70 pits, not 20. As it happens, recently released cabinet papers under the 30-year rule had confirmed that Scargill was right, that of 174 pits, around 70 were threatened with closure, which would have left us with just over 100 coal mines in the country. In 1984, Scargill calls for a strike, but crucially refuses to allow a secret ballot, as he was afraid that he would lose the secret ballot. Especially, he felt that those who were working in the non-threatened pits, the 104 pits that weren't threatened with closure, he feared that they would carry on working, as people need to earn a living, people need to eat. In May 1984, Scargill began the strike illegally, at a terrible time to choose a strike. The coal strikes had worked when they struck in the winter, when coal demand was high. May is not a good time of year to start a coal strike, when demand for electricity and heating and coal, therefore, is low. And May, right at the start of the summer, you couldn't pick a worse month, really, to start a coal strike, particularly against a government that stockpiled coal. And so, the winter is over, coal demand is low, and the secret ballot hadn't been allowed. The Notts miners left the NUM over the lack of a democratic ballot and formed the NWMC, the Notts Working Miners Committee. Now, this means that some of the most profitable and productive coal mines in the country are going to stay open, feeding coal to the government. And they've already, of course, stockpiled coal. The miners, therefore, are fatally divided at the start of the great conflict with the Thatcherite government, which is certainly prepared for the coming conflict. Scargill organises pickets to protest at those pits that stayed open. But crucially, the NACODS, the National Association of Colliery Overmen, Deputies and Shot Firers, also refused to go on strike. The government declares that as the strike was illegal, they could confiscate union funds. MI5 had already infiltrated the NUM, and thousands of police were sent to the coalfields and were often seen as an army of occupation. One of the people sent there was my uncle, who was a policeman from rural Gloucestershire, who got the fright of his life when being sent to police the coal fields in this time. And you had the Nottingham miners trying to go to work, you had picket lines trying to stop them. I don't think anybody who lived through it will forget the unpleasantness and the hatred that came from this era, which is why still it's dangerous for people from Nottingham to go north at times, because of the hatred that comes from the fact that the Nottinghamshire miners stayed working. On the 18th of July 1984, you had the Battle of Orgreave in Rotherham. The NUM had picketed a steel plant, leading to a clash between miners and police, around 5,000 on each side, with 100 injured. The Labour Party were split over what to do with the strike, but the public were broadly with the government against Scargill, due to the winter of discontent. The miners suffered extreme hardship, while the government were prepared. If you go to some of the museums on coal mining, you will see food parcels sent by the Soviet Union to try and feed the starving miners. Of course, this food helps keep them alive, but from a PR point of view, it's a disaster. It helps to, in many ways, to further undermine the public support for the coal miners, who are now seen as enemies of the state, when they're just working people and working families trying to protect their livelihoods. And so you can understand perhaps the deep hatred that came from this time. In December 1984, the UDMW, the Union of Democratic Mine Workers, was formed, and coal miners start to return to work, desperate to be able to buy food. And in March 1985, the strike is called off. From 1985 to 90, the NUM lost 84% of its members. It had lost its great battle with the government, and 94 out of 170 pits were closed. And so let us look at Nottingham and the miners' strike in more detail. Nottingham was the second biggest coal mining region in the country, behind Yorkshire. 20% went on strike in Nottinghamshire, with similar numbers in the Derbyshire fields. Across the country, however, the average was 74%. So why so few people going on strike in Nottinghamshire in particular? Well, they were the best paid in the country, due to the area level deals introduced by Tony Benn, and it was believed that their pits were safe. In the late 70s, Thoresby was the first to exceed 2 million tonnes a year. Also, many Notts miners had come from Scotland in the 60s and had been alienated by the NUM's failure to support the Scottish pits in the 1960s. Their view of the Yorkshire miners very much was, you failed to go on strike when the Scottish pits were closed. Now that the Yorkshire pits are closing, now you want us to go on strike to support you. Well, off. And so they'd already felt alienated and betrayed in the previous decades. A lot of Notts miners were Polish, especially in Ollerton pit, and they'd been alienated by Scargill's support for the Polish communist government. A lot of Nottinghamshire miners disliked the Yorkshire miners and wouldn't be forced into a legal strike by Yorkshire picketers. It's noticeable that where Welsh miners picketed Nottinghamshire miners, there the Nottinghamshire miners tended to go on strike. Where Yorkshire miners tended to picket the Nottinghamshire miners, they didn't. And so the Doncaster miners, NUM in particular, appears to have really alienated the Notts miners. But for whatever reason, these miners, and of course with any decision of not to go on strike at such times, there's a whole host of motivations. I won't tell you whether my father-in-law were on strike or not in the Calverton pit, but it's caused a lot of. But the issue I know causes a lot of tension still in the village. But for whatever their decisions, there's a host of personal reasons that, of course, comes from this. But ultimately, the Nottinghamshire miners didn't go on strike, and the government overcame the Great Coal Strike, and ultimately, the coal industry in this country was from that point doomed. Now, looking back on it, of course, many people are deeply sympathetic for the fate of the miners, and who could we fail to be sympathetic? But equally, how many young people would support the reopening of the coal mines and the burning of millions of tons of coal when we're so worried about the environment? Often, and so it's difficult to look back now on this time period because of the hatred, the suffering caused, but also the feeling that if things had turned out differently, those mines would be closed now anyway. There are areas, of course, in the world where they do dig up large amounts of coal, but whether this country wants to be one of those major producers of coal is another question. Which is why, when I was asked to write this talk for the Coal Mining Museum, you can understand my nervousness with the hatred that's on, because the talk was on the border between the Notts and Yorkshire miners' areas. It's not a good place to do a talk on coal mining. But when we look back on it, we should be profoundly sympathetic to the hard lives of the coal miners. They had always been the worst paid and worst treated of our workers that had a difficult and dangerous job to do. They have lost their communities. They have lost their livelihoods. And they lost it in a bitter strike indeed. And I hope you all stay safe during lockdown, and I'll try and put another talk up next week.